Pizza!
Parker Cannon.
I'm so stoked.
Follow me on Tumblr.
Defend pop punk.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and if any of those things mean anything to you, then you already know what this video is about. And if they don't mean anything to you, well, that's okay too. This video is about what I like to call the sad boy pop punk scene. This was a short-lived but kind of cool little like mini trend moment in the history of pop punk, where pop punk went from being silly songs about farting on your friends or whatever to something a little bit more serious but still pop punk. And if you're not familiar, I'm talking about bands like Real Friends, The Story So Far, Man Overboard, Knuckle, bands that sound like this. This quick shit, it pulls me under. Or this. And now you're just nothing but a memory. Now, I did already do a video about pop punk where I kind of touched on some of this, but that video was really more about like the early to mid 2000s, like drive-through records kind of thing. But I wanted to do an entire video about the whole sad boy thing because honestly, I really haven't heard anybody talk about it in depth. But before I get into it, I want to really quickly plug three things. First of all, I have a Patreon, so if you would be interested in that, there's a link in the description below. Second, I would love it if you follow me on Instagram. I've been posting fire on there every single day. And thing number three, I have merch. I guess a lot of people don't know that. I've had it for a while, but there's also a link to that in the description. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. Part 1, setting the stage from roughly 2000 to 2009. In order to understand the whole sad boy pop punk thing, I think it's important to first give it some context by looking back at what came before it. This video is not the entire history of pop punk, so I'm going to keep this pretty short, but basically, if you look back at pop punk from the decade or so before the sad boy bands took off, it was goofy, it was upbeat, fun, happy, but if we're being honest, I can see why so many people thought that it was corny. In the early 2000s, you had all the bands that I like to call TRL core because they were all over that MTV show called TRL. Bands like Blink-182, New Found Glory, Good Charlotte, Sum 41, Simple Plan, and all that stuff. And as much as I loved all those bands at the time, and still do, it was pretty much music for high school kids. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, don't get me wrong, but I do get why people thought it was corny and had a hard time taking it seriously. And then in the late 2000s, you had what I call the neon pop punk era, which was bands like All Time Low, Forever the Sickest Kids, Boys Like Girls, Cash Cash, The Somerset, all that kind of stuff. I call it neon pop punk because the aesthetic was just that. Neon cartoon monster merch, purple skinny jeans, swoopy hair, and it sounded like this. I kind of love that neon stuff in a weird way, and I definitely need to do a whole video about it, but if we're being honest, it was even less mature than the TRL core bands. Like, even high school kids were too old for this stuff. It was more for like middle school girls who were watching Disney Channel a couple years ago. Like, if you look at Forever the Sickest Kids, it's pretty obvious why nobody over the age of 14 or so took them seriously. Side note, I do love their first album though. So really, the thing to understand if you zoom out is that up until this point, pop punk was really seen as kid stuff. And again, like I said, I love all that stuff, but that's how it was seen at the time, and honestly, I kind of get why. Which brings us to part 2, Pop Punk Discovers Hardcore, from roughly 2009 to 2010. I think all of that started to change a bit at the very end of the 2000s with a few of the later Easycore bands. And if you're not familiar with Easycore, basically it's just pop punk with breakdowns. Bands like Chunk No Captain Chunk, 4 Year Strong, City Lights, Fight Fair, and all that kind of stuff. Hey dudes, are you ready to? And if you're interested and you haven't seen it, I did make a whole other video just about Easycore, so you can check that out if you want to find out more. Anyhow, a lot of the Easycore bands were honestly pretty juvenile and a little bit cringe in hindsight, but for this video, what I want to focus on are the Easycore bands who are a little bit more on the serious side of things. The bands who drew more from like the hardcore side of Easycore than the neon side. A couple examples of that would be Major League, Me vs. Hero, or even the first State Champs EP. No matter where we go or what we do, you'll affect me more than you could ever know. And some of the big sad boy bands actually got their start during this era as Easycore or Easycore adjacent bands. The most obvious example being the Wonder Years and their Easycore album that Soupy would love to forget. But I'm sorry, Soupy, this is the internet and nothing is forgotten. Anyhow, this little blip on the radar was interesting to me because it was a completely different take on pop punk, especially compared to the neon stuff that, like I said, sometimes almost felt like it was for children, like not even teenagers, but actual children who play with Legos. On the other hand, this stuff, the more serious Easycore stuff, was still fun and energetic and youthful, but it wasn't childish. And it was clearly drawing more from hardcore than it was from, say, Good Charlotte or Simple Plan. It was really just a handful of bands doing this stuff, but they were just the tip of the iceberg. They turned into what would be like the explosion of Sadboi pop punk bands. Which brings us to part 3, Defend Pop Punk, aka the Pizza Years, from roughly 2010 to 2015. Alright, so it took us a little bit to get here, but here we are. This is the real focus of the video. The short but awesome few years that Sadboi pop punk was booming. If I had to point to one thing that set it all off, I would say it was the release of the Wonder Years album, The Upsides, in 2010. I think this just perfectly captured that whole angsty young adult thing, in particular the song My Last Semester, which I think just really nails everything about this whole era. First of all, like the first line in the song is, "I'm not sad anymore." That really set the tone for what was going to come and also became kind of a meme in the genre, the whole "I'm not sad anymore" thing. But beyond that, at the most like basic literal level, the song is about college, which kind of automatically makes it more mature than songs about high school, right? Although reading the lyrics now, I do have to say that they're pretty cringy in that like college freshman who thinks they're a whole lot smarter and more mature than they really are kind of way. Like,
high schoolers are so immature, right? Let's go back to my dorm room and talk about deep shit in the Communist Manifesto.
Anyhow, that kicked off what I would call the Sadboi pop punk phase 1.0. And I'd say the big four of this phase were the Wonder Years, The Story So Far, Man Overboard, and I guess maybe Fireworks. This is basically where pop punk really stopped being corny stuff for high school kids. And don't get me wrong, there was plenty of corny stuff in this era, which I'll talk about, but it was so different from the stuff that defined the genre just a few years before. It was way more like gritty and dark and serious, but importantly, it still kept that underlying vibe of like having fun and hanging out with your friends that to me really defines pop punk. But now, instead of hanging out with your high school friends, you're hanging out with your college friends. And if you weren't into the genre at the time, it might not be clear what a big shift this was. So just to like really explicitly show you what a huge contrast there was, this is what a pop punk band looked like in 2008 or 2009. And this is what a pop punk band looked like just a couple years later in 2011 or 2012. Basically, this is when pop punk bands went from wearing neon cartoon monster merch and having like swoopy emo hair to wearing snapbacks, khakis, and flannels and having that like Instagram fuckboy haircut. This was just a crystal clear sign that the scene years were over. And there was that same kind of huge contrast musically as well. This is what a typical pop punk band sounded like in 2009. And this is what they sounded like in 2011. The big highlights of the Sadboi 1.0 era were, in my opinion, the song that I just played, Quicksand by The Story So Far, which really put them on the map and definitely still holds up today as a certified banger. And also, the other big thing of this era was actually not a song, but a shirt. It was Man Overboard's Defend Pop Punk shirt, which of course they put on every other piece of merch you can imagine. And if you were on Tumblr back then you'll remember that that thing was everywhere. And the whole Defend Pop Punk thing in general became a huge meme. I actually think that their merch was probably quite a bit bigger than their actual music. And the next wave of bands is what I'll call like Sadboi 2.0. These are the bands that followed in the footsteps of the bands that I just mentioned once the subgenre was kind of established. And the biggest names of Sadboi 2.0, I would say, are Neck Deep, Real Friends, Knuckle Puck, and State Champs. In my opinion, this is probably the strongest set of bands on a purely musical basis. Although, honestly, they do sound pretty similar, these bands just really nailed that formula of music that was kind of somewhere between pop punk and melodic hardcore, with, as one of my commenters put it, shouty lyrics about a girl. If I had to pick one of the bands out of this bunch as my personal favorite, I think I would probably go with Real Friends. I'm not where I should be. I'm not what I could be. But I'm not who I was. But that said, there were just so many solid bands coming out around this time. It was really cool. I felt like I was discovering a new band every week. And if you're into the stuff that I just mentioned, a few other bands you might want to check out are Such Gold, Crucial Dudes, Handguns, and Save Your Breath, among many others. And then we have Sadboi 3.0, or the soft grunge wave. Sadboi 3.0 and soft grunge in general, I think really started with Title Fight's album Shed back in 2011, but it didn't really turn into a thing until a couple years later. And basically this just refers to all the bands who came out of the pop punk scene, but then went on to play music that sounded less like pop punk and more like 90s alternative rock or shoegaze than anything else. Carelessly you pass the hours, humming songs you heard when you were young. The big bands of this kind of micro genre would be Title Fight, Citizen, Turnover, Superhaven, Basement, and Tiger's Jaw, among a few others. And honestly, this little subgenre really deserves its own video, but I'm already running long, so I'm just gonna kind of leave it at that. So at this point, we're in like 2013 and the genre is at its peak. And before I go on to talk about the decline, first I want to talk about why it worked in the first place. Like I said earlier, I think the main thing is that it was just a fresh take on pop punk that took the genre in a new and much needed direction that was really just more mature and gritty. It was still fun like pop punk, but it wasn't corny like so many of the bands in the previous generation. But at the same time, it also wasn't like as angry and aggressive as hardcore can be. It was just that perfect medium for the kid who had maybe grown out of All Time Low, but wasn't pissed and dysfunctional enough to be into Terror or Zabalba. And in hindsight, I think what made it really blow up was not just the music, but also the aesthetic. And specifically how that aesthetic was just the perfect fit for the rising popularity of Tumblr. And actually, if you look at the numbers, its rise and fall corresponds almost exactly to the rise and fall of Tumblr itself. And if you're not familiar, Tumblr was a social media platform that was really the first one to heavily emphasize visuals. I said was, it's actually still around, but nobody uses it anymore. Back then, it was actually quite active and a really cool community. You can think of it kind of like Instagram before Instagram, only instead of being full of fitness influencers, whimsical girls taking pictures as they travel the world, and fake entrepreneurs posing with a rented Lambo, it was full of depressed artsy kids in their teens and 20s. In other words, the exact right audience for Sadboi pop punk. And the Sadboi pop punk was honestly great. If you were on Tumblr back then, you'll remember this. So many pictures on Tumblr of Man Overboard merch, DSLR photos of some girl's bedroom with a Real Friends flag on the wall, the Wonder Years mascot Hank the Pigeon, tattooed couples in matching crew necks looking wistfully into the distance or laying in bed in the middle of the day, hardcore style crowd shots with the lyrics and varsity font at the top and bottom, and of course, all those edits of the story so far are Real Friends lyrics over a desaturated picture of a forest or whatever. That was the Sadboi pop punk aesthetic. And it just perfectly captured that vibe of being a kid in your late teens or early 20s, feeling pressure like you have to figure out what the fuck to do with your life, and simultaneously wanting to go back to being a kid when life was simpler, but also feeling like you're not a kid anymore and you don't want to be treated like one. It's an awkward time in your life, those late teens and early 20s.
Being so socially awkward.
Yeah.
So that's why I think the Sadboi pop punk thing blew up the way it did, but like everything else, it didn't last forever. Which brings us to part 5, the decline, which I would say started in maybe 2015. Like I said a minute ago, the rise and fall of Sadboi pop punk roughly corresponds to the rise and fall of Tumblr. And as you can see here, Tumblr peaked in 2013 and had really fallen off by 2015, and I would say that the same was pretty much true of Sadboi pop punk as well. And I think there were a few reasons for that, ones that are not entirely dissimilar to the things that have led other subgenres to fall. But just to get specific, first of all, I think a lot of the bigger bands had either just run out of steam. For example, Man Overboard's Heavy Love album in 2015 that was not well received, or if they hadn't run out of steam, they oftentimes had changed their style. For example, all the bands I mentioned that went like indie or shoegaze. But I think the biggest factor was, like I said, that so much of the genre's appeal was tied to the aesthetic. And once that aesthetic was no longer like the hot thing, once it cooled off, as all aesthetics do, after a few years, it became clear that a lot of the bands honestly just weren't great. Not bad by any means, just not memorable enough to stay relevant without the aesthetic. Basically, that's the same thing that you saw with nu metal in the 2000s or grunge in the mid-90s, anything that's like so closely tied to its image. As the saying goes, basically when the tide goes out, you find out who was swimming naked. And that's what it came down to. Most of the bands just didn't have the songs or the star power. Aside from a couple people like Parker Cannon and Soupy from the Wonder Years, and maybe a couple others I'm not thinking of, there really weren't a lot of super strong frontmen or women in the sad boy genre, and that matters a lot. So as quickly as the sad boy pop punk bubble inflated, it deflated just about as quickly. And that brings us to part 6. Present day, or sad trap, is the new pop punk. Although the genre is definitely not what it used to be in terms of relevance, most of the old bands are still around. I would say the Stories so far are the most relevant of the whole crop, with their last album hitting number 19 on Billboard, but the Wonder Years, Knuckle Puck, and Real Friends are also still around and doing well. And there's also a whole new batch of pop punk bands getting some traction. Belmont, Broadside, Grayscale, Water Parks, and With Confidence as just a few examples, but they're not really doing the sad boy thing. They're really almost more of a return to the older, more upbeat style of pop punk. The sad boy vibe really just isn't there like it used to be. I guess you could say they're not sad anymore. I think the sad boy audience is basically splintered into like 2 different directions. The first one, like I mentioned earlier, is the whole like shoegaze, math rock, indie, Midwest emo scene. Basically all the people that were into sad boy pop punk but then went further down the like alternative rock pathway. And then there's the second one, which is much more interesting to me, and I think is also a lot more culturally relevant, which is the whole alternative rap scene, sad trap or emo rap or whatever you want to call it. Basically, all the rappers that look and sound like this.
I'm fucked up. I don't think I can be saved. If I ever get redemption, it'll be inside the grave. I fucked up.
And what's interesting to me is that this is literally some of the same people who were heavily involved in the sad boy scene. The most notable examples being Wicked Phase, Springs Eternal, John from Balance and Composure, aka Creeks, and Danny from Neck Deep, who actually has a sad trap project.
When the world stops and the rain drops, I hope you know that I believe you.
Basically what I see is if you're like a 16-year-old kid that would have listened to Real Friends and Title Fight in 2011, you're listening to this stuff in 2019. In addition to the people who moved from the sad boy scene to like the emo rap scene, there's also this whole new crop of kids who I guess you would call rappers, doing really cool stuff that is, in my personal opinion, the most fresh, interesting new music around these days. It's really just like if you took the sad boy pop punk sounds and put 808s behind it.
Fan favorite, cool tattoo, did it hurt? Are you famous?
I've talked about Lil Lotus before, but I'm also a big fan of 93 Feet of Smoke, Convolk, Nothing Nowhere, and a ton of the other artists in the genre. But to me, probably the best example of this whole thing is Shinigami. He's a kid from New Jersey. I think he's like 20 or 21. He makes music that sounds like this.
You were by my side, now we're worlds away from each other. Whoa, I can't sleep, I can't eat, it feels like I'm dying.
He did a verse with Neck Deep a while ago at one of their shows. He's collaborated with Belmont and From First to Last on songs. I absolutely love what he's doing to like evolve the sad boy sound, and I'm really excited to see where this whole thing goes from here.
I killed off the sad me, left a loser in the past and now I'm glowing. If you really care about me, then show me.
So, although the 2012 like shouty lyrics about a girl sound may not be the hot new thing anymore, the sad boy vibe is definitely still here, and to be honest with you, the pizza years will always hold a special place in my heart. Alright everybody, that is the story of sad boy pop punk. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this whole thing if you were around back then. Let's also talk Tumblr. Like, what happened to Tumblr? Why did it just fall the fuck off? Is anybody left on Tumblr? Let me know what your favorite sad boy pop punk band was, but also I want to know what you guys think of that whole like sad trap emo thing that I talked about in the last segment, because honestly I think it's pretty interesting. And also I want to thank everybody who supports me on Patreon at the True Cult level or above. Andy B, Anthony C, Amber G, End of May, Jeff W, Jordan H, Jonas E, Justin H, Luke S, Michael B, Militant Me, Nick G, Ridley H, Ryan W, John R, and Wally P. You guys are true cult fans. I appreciate your support very much. If you are interested in supporting me on Patreon, members get all kinds of cool perks like an audio-only podcast feed. There's a Discord server. There's like monthly live Q&A streams, a bunch of other perks. You can check that out at the link in the description below. And with that, I'm gonna sign off for now, but I will see you later.